So we're experiencing the most significant change in ESA policy administration since the act was created over 50 years ago. As a result of a mega lawsuit, the EPA had to overhaul how it assesses the potential effects of pesticides on endangered and threatened species. And this will be reflected on pesticide labels as we move forward. Because this was a lawsuit settlement, we don't expect any broad or sweeping changes to this overall approach as we move forward. So simply put, this is going to be the new norm going forward, and that's why it's important we have these discussions and learn about the topic and answer questions. Now, to their credit, NCGA members recognized this issue's importance a few years ago and have enacted two ESA-specific resolutions, which are featured in the gray boxes you see on the slide. And these really emphasize that they wanted growers to have their voices heard as products to move through the ESA process and these label changes take place. And then they also wanted the mapping process to be as transparent and science-driven as possible. And we're going to discuss the mapping process in much greater detail here in a few minutes. Now, to ensure the best possible outcome for corn growers, we here at NCGA and your action teams represent the interest to the agencies to help inform any pesticide-related decisions. And currently, that means that we're going to focus on prioritizing the species for the mapping process. We're going to prioritize chemistries and technologies that are important to the corn production, and then generating any data that's necessary for the agency to make the best science-driven decision. So the coming pesticide label changes all started with what we call the ESA framework, and this reflects 5 different pesticide strategies. Those strategies include the herbicide strategy, the vulnerable species strategy, and the rodenticide strategies, and those 3 were completed in 2024. The insecticide strategy was completed in 2025, and a fungicide strategy is due out in April in draft form where we'll be able to provide comments, and then it's anticipated to be completed in November of this year. The strategies allow the EPA to use a conservative estimate to protect listed species before a full consultation is completed with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. And that was really the crux of that lawsuit that we talked about, which created all of these changes. It was alleged that the EPA was not taking enough efforts to protect these species, while it took a long time for the Fish and Wildlife Service to create their consultation. So these overly conservative estimates allow that protection to be in place and and allow the products to remain available for your use. It's important to remember that the pesticide labels will be implemented on a rolling basis over the next 15 years with each new registration or registration review process. So it won't be a light switch. We won't see it start and end. It'll be rolling in as products become available. So you'll need to make sure and read and follow those label directions. All of the strategies rely on a 3-step mitigation process. And that means that each product will have the opportunity for a label mitigation, and that means that the language appearing on the label would apply to all users. There would then be a field mitigation, and this will drive users to the EPA mitigation menu where you can choose mitigations that best suit your operation. And then there'll be geographic mitigations, and that drives users to the EPA Bulletins Live 2 website, where it's going to highlight any additional restrictions or limitations that are very specific to geographic locations. Now, there's a potential for some growers or regions to have difficulties with a few of the mitigations, but overall, I will say the mitigations have shaped up to be relatively balanced and achievable. And these positive developments are due to the ongoing engagement of many different grower organizations and growers throughout this process, providing feedback to the agencies as they develop the strategies. Recent final or proposed labels such as Enlist Duo, Liberty Ultra, the trifludimoxazine, diflufenican, and isoslicoslerum are all influenced by the strategies and have started incorporating elements of these ESA strategies. So these few labels, just a handful at this point, give us an excellent view into the application of the strategies. And then we make sure at NCGA and sometimes at your state level to provide comments into the federal docket. For example, like atrazine recently had a proposed label where they had the ESA mitigations listed. They were looking at an annual rate reduction, and then the agency specifically asked, are these maximum annual rates suitable for the crop that you're growing? And we can provide that information and say, yes, that's doable, or no, that is not going to be doable for corn growers of the U.S. And so we'll continue to engage on your behalf and work on species maps, get that pesticide data to the agencies for their specific decisions. Now, I mentioned on the previous slide that we wanted to continue working on species maps, and this is actually quite important. The entire premise of the ESA framework is to protect endangered and threatened species along with their critical habitat. Thus, an accurate reflection of where the species and their habitats are located is needed. The problem is that the Fish and Wildlife Service species range maps, which would provide that information, are quite dated and represent everywhere that the species could be based on historical sightings. The EPA needs what they're calling core maps for more than the 1,600 listed species to be created, and these will depict where the species are currently, not historically. To get a better understanding of that, let's look at the visual on the slide here. So envision that the green area is the farm. The large yellow box is going to represent that dated species range map, and the orange box would represent the updated core map where the species are located. So a significant reduction in acres is possible. Additionally, EPA will also determine if a pesticide use limitation area, or a PULA, is needed. And that's that geographic restriction that we talked about that would be the three-step mitigation. So in this figure, the PULA is the red dashed line buffering the orange or the yellow boxes. It's dashed because it may not always be present. It would be only for specific products and how they interact with the species. But the PULA is used to protect where a pesticide could move from into that area where the listed species may be. So the goal of the core map is to reduce the geographic area where your mitigations are needed for a particular species. So based on this figure, mitigations would focus on the refined orange box and then its associated PULA buffer rather than the larger yellow box. So depending on the species, we could have a very significant change in acreage affected with the new maps. Now let's translate this process and that figure we looked at into a real-life example. The Pasig skipperling was historically noted to be on 268,000 acres with the species range map, but with the refined core map narrowed it to a range of just 770 acres. That's a reduction of approximately 267,000 acres, which are removed from possible restrictions and mitigations. On average to date, we're seeing that core maps do result in approximately a 90% reduction of area compared to the species maps. And that's why NCGA cares about these core maps on your behalf. The process to create the core map was established by the EPA and is open for public participation. A key feature is that you must work with a modeling expert or collaborate with such an expert to create that map. So the process doesn't allow just anyone from the public to create a map. An interested party has to submit a checkout request, and then we list our expert modeler on that request. Once the checkout is confirmed, the modeler compiles both biological and spatial Fish and Wildlife Service data, and then determines what type of map is most suitable. The map is then created along with any supporting documentation. An interesting twist to this process, or an additive component to this process, is there's an opportunity for the environmental NGO that was involved in the lawsuit settlement to peer review any industry-generated maps, and then vice versa, the industry can review the NGO's maps. This step is not required, but is actually working quite well, and it facilitates EPA's acceptance of the map since both sides have essentially blessed it if it comes in with that submission component. The final maps then help to inform the boundaries of the pesticide use limitation areas, and currently about 1/3 of the 1,600 endangered species are available for core map creation. Every county in the United States has at least one ESA listed species. The blue, green, yellow map on the left shows where the ESA species densities is the highest. You can see that Southern California, Florida, and spots in Alabama and Tennessee have very high concentrations of listed species. Species needs are very unique and they will depend on the local environment. Habitat loss is the most common threat across all species, but many different stressors can lead to an ESA status. When I compiled all the listed species for the 27 core member states, there were a total of 1,221 species, as shown on the map to the right. When I accounted for any species listed that were in more than one state, that narrowed the list to 447. You can see on the map that Ohio has 29 of those endangered species, and 20 states had species that were unique just to their specific state. It's important to note that the completed maps become public and are not restricted to the creators. So we don't have to carry all of the weight for all of those 447 species and can share the workload with others. But we wanted to make sure and prioritize what species we were working on so we get the most important data for corn production. Our preference was to focus on species that are represented in most corn states. Once the location list was created, I then focused on those species most important to the cornfield, determined on a food web, and then those species affected by pesticides, ag stressors, or cropland expansion. If the species was historically present in more than 13 corn states, I deemed it to be a high priority for NCGA focus, and if it was present in more than 7 corn states, it was a medium priority. Overall, this generated 39 species of priority that I cross-checked to the EPA list of species available for core map creation. The first thing I learned when we started this process in 2025 was that there were relatively few species listed at that time for core map creation. Of the 39, just 6 species that you see on the top table in this slide were available in March of 2025. I knew that I wanted to start with 2 species for our mapping activities, so then I looked at those of which 6 species were notably affected by the ag stressors, as noted in the final column on the table. This exercise narrowed the list to 3 quickly. We had 2 clams and 1 flowering plant. The 2 clam species had a very similar historic range, so it made sense to focus on only 1, and the clubshell clam offered 3 more states coverage. Thus, clubshell clam and American chaffseed rose to the top and were selected for the first 2 species of core map creation for NCGA. In early 2026, just as our work was finishing up on those 2 species, we had the opportunity to add the round hickory nut mussel as a 3rd species of focus, and that appears on the bottom of the screen. Now, what are these species and why would they be important? American chaffseed, clubshell mussel, and the round hickory nut mussel give us a nice reach across many states. They span from the south of Florida to the north of New York and as west as Illinois. Chaffseed has a range of 14 million acres, of which 2.2 million overlap with agricultural activities. It is a perennial bee-pollinated plant, so it can be affected by herbicides and insecticides. The clubshell mussel has a range of 6.7 million acres, of which 1.3 million overlap with agricultural activities, and the clubshell is found in medium to small streams and has an extraordinarily long lifespan of up to 50 years. The round hickory nut mussel spans 921 river miles, prefers gravelly locations, and has seen a population decline of greater than 75%. Now, we have 2 mussels on this list. Mussels and clams are particularly important because they filter water and can be affected by both runoff and erosion and spray drift of these pesticides. So herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides may require mitigations to limit exposure to clams. It's important to note that if all 447 species from the corn states were available for core map creation at one time, we may have deemed other species to be more important. But we worked with what was available at the time, and it's made significant impacts, and we've learned a lot along the way in this process. So, of course, round hickory nut, the work is still in progress because we added that just this year, but the proposed core maps for American chaffseed and clubshell mussel are complete and are pending QA/QC at the EPA. We did choose to participate in the environmental NGO peer review process, so both maps are blessed and expected to move forward with very few issues. For both completed species, we've reduced the affected acreage for corn acres by greater than 99%. If we calculate the return on investment here, each core map protected approximately $120 acres per dollar invested, preserved approximately 20,000 bushels annually per dollar invested, and saved approximately $35,000 of annual revenue per dollar invested. Now, we need to note these savings are specific for growers in areas affected directly by those 2 species. And not all core maps are expected to have this big a value as we move forward, because by the time we get to species number 1600, there could be very few acres left to be modified. So where do the core maps overall stand for today? The EPA currently has listed 526 species on the core map checkout site. That's about a third of the 1600 species. 7 core maps are final, 150 have been marked as interim, and that means that the EPA has done its QA/QC and it's sufficient for their use, but it's still awaiting a finalization by the Fish and Wildlife Service. 349 species are checked out and 16 are available for checkout. 1 species has been delisted and 3 are unmarked at this time. So how does that align with our priority species from the 39 we listed? 25 are in progress, and those are grayed out on this chart. 0 are open for checkout currently, and we currently have the 3 checked out to us, with 2 being back at the EPA for further activity. Now, those 11 remaining species that are not available, the white ones on the chart, they may never actually become available to us, particularly since they cross so many states. In those cases, registrants are often stepping up and completing the maps to support the pending registrations. So since we have the nationally prioritized species underway and monitoring the availability, we're turning now to phase 2 of the Core Map project. And this means alerting states as to the species that might be unique for their states or that they share with a few other states. And this way, the state can choose if they want to prioritize a core map to limit pesticide restrictions. So this phase has only just begun, and you're one of the first states to see their state-specific information. In Ohio, you have 10 ESA listed species that are not on the NCGA priority list. The good news is that 9 out of the 10 species have core maps in progress and are complete, and the one remaining species does not tend to list agriculture or pesticides as a population stressor. So given this information, it seems that Ohio doesn't have any additional work to do on core maps. So what else are we doing? Recognizing that grower education is very important, we recently took advantage of the huge contingency of growers at the Commodity Classic, and we spearheaded an initiative with USB. We were joined by other headlining commodity associations to sponsor a session on the main stage where we showed a mitigation overview video prepared by CLA, ARA, and CPDA. This is one of a 4-part series featuring Dr. Stanley Culpepper from the University of Georgia Extension, breaking down the information into small segments. Additionally, we were joined by 8 other organizations on the trade show floor to provide in-booth education on the most important ESA topics with these label changes. We incentivized trade show attendees to learn about ESA by offering a connected raffle for Amazon gift cards. The panel in the middle of the slide was featured in the NCGA booth and highlights the runoff mitigations that are most often found in cornfields. Perhaps the best news there is that the non-irrigated land qualifies for 3 mitigation points and encompasses approximately 95% of the corn acres. And so that's just the start of the education you'll see. You'll continue to see these educational opportunities at national, state, and county levels as the labels change to reflect more changes. So the biggest current need is raising grower awareness, which is why it's so important that we're here talking with you today. The growers need to get comfortable with the 3-step mitigation process, which is going to be the backbone of successful compliance. This 3-step mitigation process will apply to all classes of pesticides. The spray drift buffers at the top of the slide will be the most cumbersome to start with because it will take an effort. You're going to have to calculate these each time a product is used to account for any environmental conditions. In the middle section is Bulletins Live 2 and the PULAs, which you'll check at the Bulletins Live 2 website. And this is probably the easiest because if you know in advance what you're going to apply, you can check this website up to 6 months in advance. So for instance, if you have a favorite fungicide you tend to apply every June, probably a good idea to print that bulletin out in January or February when activities are slower and plan ahead for any possible restrictions. The runoff and erosion mitigations at the bottom of the slide will be one of the easiest steps because you only have to calculate this once for each field, or if you make changes in the future. If a grower targets 9 points, that's the worst case scenario, they'll be ready to use any product available. We will never see more than 9 points for a mitigation total. So it's going to take time to get used to this, but like anything, the more familiar it becomes, the more routine it becomes. Here I just want to show you that this Liberty Ultra was one of the first herbicides labeled for the new herbicide strategy. Training and education was a condition of the registration, so I'm pretty sure that some of the users on this line probably received some sort of education prior to its use. And then what I really want to show is that you have 2 different flyers here, and you'll see both of them have that 3-step mitigation process referred to. This will be something that we're going to see repeatedly come out. So you've heard a lot about the different mitigations on this talk. I thought I would just spend a moment to give you a glimpse of what some of the common runoff mitigations are that might be. So we mentioned irrigation. If you're dryland farming, it's 3 points. You can choose from conservation tillage, different cover crops, contour terrace farming, erosion buffers, grassed waterways, vegetative strips. There will be a lot of options on this mitigation menu to choose from. And in most cases, registrants are negotiating with the agencies to make label changes so that it translates to fewer runoff points that you have to calculate. It'll just become label language on there. And I've actually heard that numerous corn growers and their trusted advisors state that these mitigations are achievable. And if not, the grower probably needs to look at the operation and make some changes in the idea of continuous improvement. So that's pretty strong information coming forward that the mitigations are doable. As I mentioned, the spray drift mitigations will be a bit more complicated as they require more mathematical skills, but it's achievable. But in this case, you'll be looking at percent reductions based on different components such as the equipment you're using, the boom height, and then the droplet size. So what are the next steps that your action teams are looking at? They're going to continue to contribute to core maps as needed from the national and state level. We'll offer comments in support of proposed labels and make suggestions when needed to refine the proposed mitigations. We're anxiously awaiting the fungicide strategy, but are told it should not cause too much concern as it'll continue to build upon the mitigation menu that's been set for the herbicides and insecticides. The Production Sustainability Action Team is also engaging in a variety of project reviews. For instance, the AgDIS project, which is coordinated by the National Agricultural Aviation Association, is looking to modernize the drift modeling program that's utilized by the EPA, and this would extend the model for ground applications as well, and we are currently involved in that project. A future project that we're looking at looks to maybe create a baseline field or point resource for your runoff erosion mitigation points. And this would be a time saver because you would have a starting baseline point to know how many more points you might need to achieve. And that's still under review. And finally, I'll close here with a slide that highlights some of the important resources available to you, including one from your very own The Ohio State University. So on the left hand of the slide, there's some links to the EPA menus, which takes you to the mitigation menu or pictures of what the different mitigations are. Then there's that 4-part video series I mentioned, which breaks it down really in great language as to what growers need to do to achieve all the different steps. And then at the bottom, the FSTIF or the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force, that's more technical information if you want to dig in a little deeper. And then the checklist from The Ohio State University goes through much of what we covered on here and finishes up with that 3-step mitigation process. So with that, I'll say thank you.